We'll continue today with our lecture series, and we are now starting to get into soil fertility management. So just to recap, we started off by looking at the nutrient cycles and how nutrients are cycling through agroecosystems, what are the important pools, what are the important transformations. Then we went a little bit further into that and looked at how much is in each pool, what is really in the inorganic nitrogen pool, what does the organic phosphorus comprised of. And then we started to look at processes, how these link together, how is inorganic phosphorus transformed in organic and vice versa, how absorption, desorption phenomena controlled. And then in the next phase of our lecture, we were looking at how environmental factors such as temperature, moisture, pH, clay mineralogy, all of these factors, how they are affecting transformations and specifically nutrient availability. And now we're going sort of to the human factors. So what can we do? What are our options to influence nutrient availability? And of course, top of the list is something very conventional, fertilization. We add nutrients, we add them in organic, inorganic form, but there is a multitude of different ways of doing that. There are a multitude of different fertilizers, and we don't want to go too much in detail, but we want to highlight a few principles and alert you to some basic concepts of what you have to look at. Then we want to look at the environmental hazards of fertilization after that, especially with respect to gaseous losses and leaching losses. And then highlight a few management aspects of very specific soils, because they're not so uncommon as you would think. And secondly, they have very, very specific management constraints and opportunities we want to look at. Decreasing leaching, erosion, we're mainly dealing in an upper level course, as well as increasing availability of nutrients present in the soil, for instance through transformations between organic and inorganic forms. So we'll do that later. Let's start off with a little bit history. This guy is called Justus Liebig, and if you look at the dates, it's not so far away. It's not so long ago that the first mineral fertilizers have been invented, so to speak. You see here, Justus Liebig lived in the 19th century. He was first a professor in Gießen, then in Munich, and he developed the theory of mineral elements. Although apparently the first trials that he did were quite devastating, so it was a very, very poor growth on his fields when he tried it out, his concepts. And for years and years, he was really mocked at. He was the joke of the academic societies. But if you look at his achievements, 44 of the first 60 Nobel Prizes for chemistry go to his students. That's quite an achievement. He himself never got the Nobel Prize because he died earlier than the Nobel Prize was even instated. So he never got the Nobel Prize, but a lot of his students got Nobel Prizes for chemistry. But he was a really generalist, like that was very, very common in the 19th century and earlier, that these folks were not just scientists in one particular area, but he invented something like the baby food, silver mirror, or baking powder. So he published letters, these science letters, for all kinds of topics. He was also very important for the medical field. He published a lot about blood circulation, etc. So this is his new laboratory in Gießen. And apparently that was a state-of-the-art laboratory. It looks quite fancy, actually. And this is what it looks today. So today this is a museum. And you can see still some of the old appliances. And it's quite fun to look at that. So what were his basic and chief advancements that what did he contribute to science? for understanding that, we have to know what really was the state of the art or the state of the science in 1837 when Liebig started to think about these issues and when he developed his first theories. Intensive agriculture was thought that the plants actually feed from humus, so that for some miraculous way the nutrients are formed in the plants by the plant taking up humus into the plant. And if you think about it, it's not so strange that in those days, if you didn't have any clue about that there were nutrients and that they're essential for plants as well as for humans, that in those soils where you have good humus, where it's brown soil, it smells like humus, those are the soils where plants grow very well. And once that is depleted, it goes down, there's maybe minerals show up more, organic matter is lower, then you don't have very good growth. So sort of there was an understanding that soil organic matter, humus, is really essential for plant growth, but the mechanics of that, the processes were not really very well understood. So when he entered the stage, he postulated that the plants actually need mineral nutrients for their development and that they take them up through their roots. Sounds kind of very, very basic to us now, but at these times it was really a very, very controversial theory. And as I said, he remained the joke of the academic field for quite a long time. And the second one here, that the soil only remains fertile if these nutrients that are taken up are actually replenished. So you have to give the soil nutrients so the plant can take it up. And the need of the plants for these nutrients depends on the plant species, and that the nutrients cannot be substituted by each other. And you might have seen this barrel before. So it's this principle of a minimum factor that you can have all other nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus or you can other factors, water and light and everything you can have in ample supply. But if one of the factors, and in this case he was interested in nutrients, for instance potassium, if one of the nutrients such as potassium is not in sufficient demand, you will never reach your production potential. So in this case, the water will always flow out that side where you have your minimum factor. So you really need all those factors, and you need to improve all those factors and increase nutrient availability for all of those to be able to increase your production potential. And that is something, that's why he also failed in early days. He just tried out. I mean, he put maybe on, I don't know what exactly, but he put on phosphorus and maybe kali, potassium, but he forgot about nitrogen because he didn't know about it at the time. So until he really understood, I have to put in nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, zinc, copper, iron, until he had figured that out and figured out how to do that, even where to get that from and how much to put on. I mean, nobody knew whether nitrogen was a microelement and was in no demand at all, or whether molybdenum was the real thing that they take up 500 kilograms per hectare. Nobody knew at the time. So he really had to do trial and error to find that out. And that's why in the early days when he made his experiments, he really, he was always confronted with almost no yields. There are very funny descriptions about that. For years and years and years, he didn't produce anything until he had figured that out. And of course, then this was a huge breakthrough. And maybe what we can do now, I gave you one of his letters, these chemical letters that have been also translated into English. And maybe we can look at those, what theories he had at the time. And what he understood already very well, and what he probably still missed at that point. So maybe we'll group again into 3 groups and discuss a little bit. Can you 4 go together? Maybe the 3 of you and the 3 of you, David. Hi. And why don't we give ourselves about 10 minutes time. You go through the questions, and then we'll discuss together. Discuss the paper in the plenary. I was wondering, when you read this, and we've been reading it, you probably for your research have been reading now a lot of scientific paper. What strikes you that how scientific papers at this time were written? I mean, this is a scientific paper. So what strikes you compared to today's papers, if you read papers? What do they look like in comparison to this here? Very philosophical, yeah. So, what else?
It seems to connect everything into like a huge, very broad sense,
Mm-hmm.
and tries to liken the nutrients in soil to everything else, and
Very broad view also. I mean, these were, like I said before, probably somebody who develops the mineral fertilizer, publishes on the blood circulation, and invents baby food is probably a pretty broad person, has a very broad view. I mean, he uses language like art and science and very broad, actually. Yeah, what else in terms of the format or how they develop theories?
I think
Evan?
it's science, but the depth of science is not that deep.
So you think the depth of science is not very deep, or yeah, you could maybe argue that. What else?
Well, he doesn't necessarily support his theories with numbers.
Numbers, yeah. So no numbers, no table, no figure in here. And actually, if you look at, I looked at quite a bit of these papers, also other papers by other scientists of the same time. Also with cation exchange capacity, how that was developed. There's not a single table, not a single figure. That doesn't come into the picture, actually, at these times. Yeah. So, and also from the very format, they start with "My dear sir." We wouldn't do that in a scientific paper these days, probably. We start with an abstract that very often we write in the third person. This was done, and that was done, not I think this is a great idea to be doing, or this I did. It depends, but it's a very, very personal approach to it, whereas we have a much more objective approach to science. Has to be verifiable, reproducible, etc. So it's quite different. If we go to the specific questions that we were working on, so how does fallowing affect nutrient availability? What does he think, according to Liebig?
Sort of, it starts out by talking about how plant uptake actually depletes soils of nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
Plant the same crop year after year, that soil will become nutrient deficient for that crop.
Yeah.
So then fallow is kind of the opposite side, and you have the sort of chemical weathering
Mm-hmm.
and disintegration of rock.
Mm-hmm.
Processes and aided by aeration and temperature and moisture and all that. And it makes certain nutrients more available to plants over time when crops aren't grown.
Yeah. So recognizing that fallowing is actually will improve nutrient availability, and he mentions a few processes. Yeah. So which processes are these that he gets? And you started by listing a few. In terms of how we talk about those today, what would you think he understood already, and what are processes that you think he got quite well, or more or less at least he mentioned?
The breakdown of rocks.
Breakdown of rocks. So just the physical breaking of rocks. Did he get also? What else do you think in terms of that process? Oh, what do we call it today? Probably weathering. Yeah. But there are different ways of weathering. There are lots of different weathering processes. So, which ones did he understood? And chemical? Yeah, so physical a little bit, it is crushing.
We talked about the mechanical.
Mechanical, yeah. And chemical in which way? What does he list here?
Carbonic acid,
Carbonic acid,
oxygen,
oxygen, yeah. Water, yeah. Some dissolution probably, yeah. Temperature changes, yeah. So it breaks apart due to temperature changes, yeah. Other things. What are on the weathering side? Maybe what he didn't list. What are things that he didn't list on the temperature side? On the weathering side. Sorry.
Physical weathering. I mean, he does talk about, you know, pounding it down into powder.
Yeah.
He doesn't really talk about, you know, wind and water causing erosion or anything like that.
Yeah. No, he doesn't mention any erosion. That's true. Yeah. What are other things? Dave?
He talks about decomposition of the soil. He uses that word a few times,
Yeah.
but we normally relate that to microbial action rather than the sort of decomposition he's talking about.
Yeah. So he uses erroneously, I think, from our viewpoint today, the word decomposition. Yeah. And maybe not. Maybe he already tried to say something there that we don't understand. But yeah, I would agree with you. What did he forget, or what did he not mention? What are important processes that we've been looking at throughout the last weeks that he doesn't mention at all? Andrew?
Mostly biological processes.
Biological processes he doesn't mention, yes.
Fertilization,
Yeah,
stuff like that. Microbial processes.
yeah,
Fluxes and so on.
yeah. So anything microbial he doesn't really seem to be incorporating into his theory. Yeah. Other processes that we've been talking about which don't explicitly appear here. Adsorption. Yeah, so there's no mention about adsorption, desorption phenomena. It's either coming in through weathering or then it's taken up by the plant, but there's no going back into the soil. So the concept of if I would apply nutrients, that it would also disappear, is not mentioned here. And we know, we've read about adsorption, a paper that mentions that we can apply hundreds of kilograms of phosphorus and see maybe nothing of it because adsorption is so strong. Or we apply a lot of nitrogen and it's getting immobilized. And he doesn't capture that process at all at this point. Another process that we've been talking about, well, just a minor one. Leaching, for instance, yeah. Like an extreme form of adsorption or the one spectrum precipitation also, he doesn't really mention that there's could be formation of calcium phosphates or so. He doesn't mention any of that.
Well, also in line with the microbial, he kind of, since he avoids microbial processes, he doesn't get involved in the nitrogen cycle at all. He doesn't talk about atmospheric deposition or anything having to do with like what you would think
Yeah.
of the nitrogen cycle.
Yeah, so he misses that atmospheric deposition completely, yeah. And especially the nitrogen cycling being so intricately linked with microbial or biological processes from the fixation. And we now know that through evolutionary times, but also through soil development stages over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, that biological nitrogen fixation is really a key process. Otherwise, there is no nitrogen in the soil, really. There's no, through weathering, we don't really get any nitrogen in our soil. So this is all drawn in from the atmosphere through biological nitrogen fixation. And we can show that evolutionary, but we can show that also through soil development with development of vegetation on sand dunes or lava flows or so, where we can really show that at the beginning there's very little nitrogen, only through atmospheric deposition, and only over time through biological nitrogen fixation we stock up in our ecosystems. Yeah, so I thought that was quite interesting to see a viewpoint from 150 years ago and see what those folks had to deal with and where they were. I think we can appreciate that in these 150 years we've come quite far in our understanding. And on the other hand, we'll have really a lot of different issues that we are still dealing with. We want to start by very straightforward way of increasing our or changing our nutrient availability, and that is through fertilization. We'll first talk a bit about inorganic fertilizers and then about organic fertilizers. And it's quite instructive to look at production as well as nutrient forms and solubility. We've been doing that also with the nutrient pools in soil, and I think that helps us a lot to understand the ecology. Then we would like to look a bit at the amount and placement of fertilizers and the losses environmental hazard that can result in. And we'll focus on leaching, erosion, but also the gaseous losses and the release of other hazardous chemicals. Let's start with inorganic fertilization and the nitrogen fertilizers. There are several different ways, and please don't learn this by heart, but just to so you have heard that once. There are several different ways of doing that, but by far the most important nowadays is this Haber-Bosch process, where with hydrogen and nitrogen from the atmosphere. In all cases, you can see it's always coming from the atmosphere. So that's where we get our nitrogen. It's not a nitrogen deposit somewhere that we dig up, but it's nitrogen from the atmosphere that we transform into nitrate or ammonia or cyanamide, and then let react with other chemicals to get our nitrogen fertilizers. And very often there are catalysts involved and high temperature and high pressure, and you can already imagine all these temperatures here. They're pretty high under which these reactions develop. And what do you think is now for us is a big issue in our today's world with these kind of fossil fuels? So yeah, so this is a high energy process. You need a lot of energy to do this. And production of nitrogen fertilizers, the #1 energy consumption in today's agriculture. It's not driving with your tractor around. It's not heating your barn or even your house. Really, the production of nitrogen fertilizer is what consumes most of the energy. So if we can reduce our nitrogen fertilization in our economies, we will save a lot of energy in the agricultural production. Phosphorus fertilizers, completely different, as usual with phosphorus and nitrogen cycles and everything. So almost all the fertilizers are made from natural phosphate rock. And these can be, they're called apatites, and they can be various forms. And there can be fluoride or hydroxide or chloride or carbonate apatites, and they contain about somewhere in the 30%. What are another fertilizer, phosphorus fertilizer, which is maybe of local importance? These some islands maybe. Yeah, David. Guano. Yeah. So what is that?
It's just like build up bird poop.
Yeah, exactly. It's just bird poop somewhere, and you mine that. So while that is a really good phosphorus fertilizer, is really not a huge deposit. I think it's quite expensive also. But it's not locally in some areas important, but generally speaking not very important. So what is happening then, you take this rock phosphate, the apatite, and it's dissolved with acid, mostly actually sulfuric acid. You need heat again, and then you produce something that's called superphosphates. with different grades, and we'll look at that a little later. You can also directly use your phosphate rock, and you need to grind that, and it depends very much what kind of phosphate rock you have. You can also do an ammoniation of the calcium phosphate to get a calcium ammonium phosphate. You see here a map from Africa where there are local apatite rock phosphate deposits. So you see it's not uncommon to have rock phosphate deposits. So an opportunity would be to directly utilize them somewhere. But you see also that there's whole countries that don't have anything, or here Central African Republic has just one. So you can also argue, well, maybe it's not all that much. But as a continent, you see there are opportunities. Potassium fertilizers are also mined and are applied as minerals, as KCl, or as potassium sulfate. If, for instance, because there's a lot of chloride in these potassium chloride fertilizers, you would choose calcium sulfate where chloride is actually a problem. And then we will see that with other elements as well. You also apply potassium, of course, when you apply other fertilizers because it happens to be in there. For instance, a nitrate fertilizer, if you happen to use potassium nitrate, you're applying, of course, also potassium with your nitrate. The same with potassium phosphate. Sulfur fertilizers are also obtained from deposits and come as elemental sulfur from deposits, mainly as gypsum, which is what chemical form is gypsum? Calcium sulfate. Calcium sulfate, yeah. So gypsum is calcium sulfate, and is actually also a good liming material. You're right. But in today's world, it's actually very often applied as a byproduct of other fertilizers. For instance, single superphosphate. So if you apply a phosphate fertilizer, the sulfate comes with it, or ammonium sulfate, although this is not used today as much anymore. But ammonium sulfate used to be an important fertilizer, and you would apply it with the nitrogen. Calcium and magnesium fertilizers mostly obtained from deposits, from gypsum and carbonates, dolomites, and as well it is in other fertilizers in single superphosphate and triple superphosphate. Now let's look at these nutrient forms, how much is in each of these fertilizers, and the availability of those nutrients, and a little bit a guideline how important they are today, although this can be regionally very different. Nitrogen used to be ammonium sulfate, has today a low importance. Why would you guess it has a low importance today? You can already guess it maybe from this chart. Relatively low content of nitrogen, so 21% of nitrogen in ammonium sulfate. That means transportation costs are very high. If you need to hail it around and has only 20% versus something else that has maybe 40% or even 80% nitrogen. Since transportation is a big deal, you're probably switching to others. Like urea is a very popular one. The nitrates actually only regionally. China produces a lot of ammonium bicarbonate, for instance. This and is used in China a lot, but really nowhere else in the world. Anhydrous ammonia is used a lot in the US, but not so much in Europe. Ammonium nitrate is used more in Europe. Sulfur, elemental sulfur, great, looks good, 100% sulfur. I mean, you can't get really higher than 100%. But the availability is actually very, very low. And that's the reason why this is only used in circumstances where you might not need a high availability, or you might actually want a low availability, a low immediate availability, or where you don't have any other options. You don't get anything else. Gypsum is really not very important. Well, in some areas you're interested in the liming effect of gypsum. We'll get to that when we talk about some of these specific soils, but anybody a guess when you are really interested in gypsum as a liming material?
Saline or sodic soils?
Yeah, you could be. Yeah, you could be. Yeah. Why would you be there interested?
Counteract the effect of the sodium.
Yeah. So you have the calcium that hopefully replaces some of the sodium and gives the soil stability again. Yeah, that's a good point. Another point for liming with gypsum instead of lime, instead of calcium carbonates. Yeah.
Really good for really dry land, hard, high bulk density to sort of loosen the soil. So gypsum used for
Yeah. That's sort of the physical aspect of improving the physical aspects of sodic soils in dry lands. Yeah, I think that is probably an important aspect. Yeah. And if you go at the other spectrum, humid tropics, why would you be interested in using gypsum? Is there
acidification.
And why not use lime? Why not use calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate? Why using calcium sulfate?
Sulfur tie up the iron.
Yeah. Try. Yeah, David.
It's got to do with the fact that gypsum is more soluble, so maybe you're getting better penetration of the gypsum into the soil.
Yeah. So you get a better leaching down. Well, sounds kind of something that we never want to have leaching, but actually in this case we want to. If you apply lime, it very often sticks to the surface. You need actually also an anion, the sulfate, to drag down your calcium, and you get. If you're using lime, the effect of the pH increase is very often restricted the first few centimeters or wherever you incorporate it, to which depth. But the sulfate, the calcium sulfate, penetrates deeper. So actually, since the roots in these low pH soils that have very low calcium, the roots for their growth need calcium, and you supply the calcium in the depth where the roots needs it, and so you get a deeper penetration. With all the beneficial effects of exploring a larger soil volume for water availability, but also nutrient availability. So that can be an incentive to use gypsum. So it can be regionally important in very acid soils. Pyrites has a high sulfur content, but doesn't really dissolve and is not really important. Ammonium sulfate, well, since it's not used that much anymore, you don't get it, and that is really a problem. This would be a very good sulfur source. Single superphosphate has lower, and triple superphosphate almost nothing. Well, what do you think now happens if we switch more and more from ammonium sulfate to urea? And from single superphosphate to triple superphosphate, what do you think happens with sulfur in our soils? It's probably going to get deficient. So you see that triple superphosphate has only 2% sulfur. Most farmers would now apply something like triple superphosphate, maybe other nitrogen phosphate fertilizers, but very often triple superphosphate. During the shift in the last 20 years from single superphosphate to triple superphosphate, and from ammonium sulfate to urea, which doesn't have any sulfur in it, we bought ourselves now slowly a serious problem that sulfur deficiency is actually popping up all over the place now in the world. And can you think about a couple of other reasons why sulfur deficiency might pop up now that we have never dealt in the last 50 years or 80 years, we have never dealt with sulfur as a deficient element. We know it's essential plant element, it's needed for plant growth in actually appreciable amounts, not huge amounts, but appreciable amounts, but have never run really into sulfur deficiency in the last decades or in the last century. Well, maybe in very rare cases. These are a reason the shift in fertilizer applications where sulfur is actually just a co-product, a co-application. What are other reasons why maybe sulfur is now deficient? Becomes deficient. You have to think wider. Angela.
I heard that sulfur used to be sort of deposited on the soil from smog factories.
Yeah, so emissions, anthropogenic emissions have been a very large contributor from power plants, coal-firing plants. They're getting so good in filtering that the atmospheric depositions are very low now. Well, that's good on the one hand, maybe bad for agricultural soils because we're now lacking sulfur. What are maybe other reasons? Just general, what happened during the last 50 or 100 years with crop production? We're just getting much better in everything. I mean, we're breeding hybrids that grow much better. We've figured out all kinds of management tools. We're fertilizing optimally with everything else. So I showed you, I think at the beginning of the first lecture, I showed you that around 1900 or 1800, a good crop in Paris, around Paris, was about 1 ton of grain. I mean, we would laugh about that today. In Kenya, you would say 1 ton would be less than what the average farmer can live on. I mean, they want to. That's maybe around 1 ton maize yield is about what average, sub-average farmer, smallholder farmer in Kenya would produce, and we find that unacceptably low. And that was standard in 1900 in Paris, and in the last century, we bumped that up to 5-8 tons per hectare of grain, depending on which grain, maize or wheat. And at the same time, and that of course requires 8 times more nutrients. In 1900, although we didn't apply anything, we might not have run into sulfur problems, but today we do if we don't apply as much sulfur with our fertilizer, with our phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizers, and we have lower atmospheric emissions than we had 20, 30 years ago. So that's quite a peculiar thing that can happen, and we really need to know what else we apply with our fertilizers. We might target nitrogen, but look very closely what else you're applying. Phosphorus, and here's a reason why we would shift from single superphosphates to triple, because they just contain double the amount, or in this case it's triple the amount of phosphorus. So it makes a lot of sense to apply triple superphosphate instead of single, but then we lack the sulfur probably. So triple superphosphate has a high importance. Both superphosphates are highly available. Ammonium phosphate is very often used also. It has a high availability. Phosphate rock direct application. The amount, depending on which one you get, is acceptable possibly, but the availability can be very low. So it has actually a regional importance, but this is an important area for research where we have opportunities, especially for developing countries that have access to deposits. And then there are some exotics, geothermal phosphates. Potassium, KCl, you see 50% potassium. In KCl, there's not much more than K and Cl, so the rest is, of course, chloride. It's immediately available, whereas calcium sulfates are of low importance, usually have a little lower potassium concentration, but no chloride, which might be interesting in some instances. Calcium, mostly applied as lime, or where you don't apply lime because you don't need to apply lime, then of course very often you get your calcium through the application of single superphosphate or triple superphosphate. And they have 10 to 20% of their mass is calcium. So you apply actually quite a lot of calcium with your phosphorus fertilizer. And in many instances that would be possibly enough to replenish any offtakes or to avoid deficiencies when you have other sources such as from weathering or deposition. Magnesium via dolomite in acid soils where you have a good dissolution of the dolomite. Otherwise, it's magnesium sulfate. But very often that is actually not necessary. You get it from other sources. Iron as iron sulfate or iron oxide, though the availability of this iron oxide is low. Iron chelates as very often also as a foliar application, and we've been talking about that in the lab a lot. That with group 8. That would be a very popular method of application for fruit trees, actually, on those soils where we have immediate fixation or precipitation of irons to iron carbonates. Manganese, very similar as manganese sulfate, has a high importance. The others have a low importance, and then you have again, the option of applying foliar application, and a very similar story for the copper as well. Zinc, same story practically. Zinc sulfates have a high importance, and then you have a zinc oxide that usually nobody's using, and zinc chelates then as a foliar application. Boron has some products here, the so-called borax or the boric acid. Also here foliar applications are possible, and very similar story for molybdenum. So that gives us a brief overview how much of a nutrient is in these fertilizers, and actually what forms are in there. Now, how does that translate into availability? And the solubility is, of course, an important factor of that. What we want to achieve, of course, is a release, or that these nutrients are becoming available in synchrony with plant demands. That's pretty self-explanatory. If we have a high solubility, it's immediately available. That's great. The plant can take it up. So we probably want to have a high solubility. Well, but with high solubility, you're buying probably also that a danger, a challenge that your nutrients are being either leached for nitrogen, because they are then in soil solution. Available means being in soil solution, because that's where the nutrients are taken up from by the plant, or available to microorganisms or adsorption. That means they're being fixed or immobilized, and that's also something that we don't want. So it's probably very often a challenge that you're in that you can't really resolve. To have high availability, you're probably buying into danger for leaching. And to find this middle path is probably very, very difficult. The solubility is controlled by the chemical form. We've already talked about that triple superphosphate is more soluble than phosphate rock just because of the chemistry of those two. And we know already that nitrate is more mobile than ammonium in most soils that are dominated by cation exchange capacity. But they also control the solubility by the physical form. And for instance, finely ground anything is more soluble than larger particles. But you can use that concept also to make nutrients less available if you so choose, because you actually want to make a fertilizer less available, then you can do that by increasing particle size, for instance. Here an example how the chemical form affects the solubility, and we'll compare here for a Candio delf in Western Kenya, triple superphosphate and phosphate rock compared to a control. And you see here that the resin extractable, what would be the resin extractable phosphorus? What type of, in terms of the ecology of the soil, what phosphate would that be? So it's probably immediately available, yeah. So resin extractable. What would it extract, you think? What in terms of the chemical form or the in what state is that phosphate in the soil? This immediately available form. It's in solution, yeah. Maybe a little bit adsorbed, but not much. So mainly phosphate in solution that is immediately available. And we see there's a huge jump between the control and triple superphosphate. It's more than an order of magnitude difference. And actually there's quite an increase also for the phosphate rock, but with an application of equal amounts, it's about half of the amount that could be achieved with triple superphosphate in this example. Then the bicarbonate extraction shows similar, also an order of magnitude, but quite a lower increase, actually a non-significant increase, well, therefore being no increase at all, for the phosphate rock. What's the bicarbonate extraction? What would that extract? What other name do we have for that? Helen? Olsen P, yeah. So what would that extract? What is Olsen P or this bicarbonate extracting?
It's still plain available, but isn't it for like in the basic crop period soils?
Yeah. So very often it's one of the extraction methods that are also suitable for soils with a higher pH. That's correct, yeah. And it's like you said, it's extracting the available pool, probably a little bit more the adsorbed phosphates than the resin would. So whereas the resin probably takes up in most soils, depending on how exactly you do the extraction, mostly the solution phosphorus, whereas the bicarbonate would probably more feed also and desorb some of the adsorbed pool. And then the sodium hydroxide pool, you see again quite an increase here to the triple superphosphate, and lower, this time significant, but lower increase with the phosphate rock. What's the sodium hydroxide doing? What would you think is that extracting? And yeah, it's extractable inorganic phosphorus.
Like everything but the really hard to get mineral. You just hydrolyze some of those bonds.
Yeah.
Iron.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's also adsorbed phosphates, but strongly adsorbed, more strongly adsorbed, probably not the covalent bondage that is with a double bondage to the iron and aluminum oxides, but probably those phosphates that are fairly strongly bound to iron and aluminum oxides. And you can see here there's also quite an increase here. What we didn't show here, what they didn't look at, is the HCl extractable phosphorus and all the very recalcitrant pools, those associated with calcium phosphates, and we probably find a lot of our phosphate rock P in those fractions. So you can see from the very available, the solution P over the a little bit more adsorbed but still plant available to the probably less plant available but not yet fixed, we have quite an increase with TSB, but not much of an increase, or in some, for this fraction even, no increase for the phosphate rock. So we can probably conclude that, and that is actually a pattern that seems to be true for many situations, that the phosphate rock does not increase phosphorus availability to the extent as the TSB would for similar phosphorus application rates. Physical form I already mentioned. Here an example for sulfur, and we have the application of gypsum in Georgia, and gypsum was applied, well, either not applied or in pellets or granular, just very coarse, a coarse powder, but then also finely ground and in crystalline form, so single crystals, very, very fine powder. And you can see just by doing that, just by making it finer, we probably increase the solubility, and we quite substantially increase the yields of peanut in this case. So just by grinding it finer, we did probably quite well improving the availability of the gypsum. So while we first now talked about the solubility and the physical and chemical forms, something that is very important and is getting now a bit more complex is composition and interaction of nutrients. Mixtures of different forms of the same nutrients may, in some instances, enhance efficiency. So there have been found evidence that if you apply phosphate rock and triple superphosphate together, you actually get a higher dissolution of the phosphate rock. Because you apply sulfur, and there are some thiobacillus that would work on the sulfur and at the same time dissolve then the phosphate rock. So these are quite interesting. This is just an example, but it should show you that there are really a lot of opportunities to manipulate solubility and availability of applied fertilizers by combining them with others, and we'll go later also into the inorganic, organic stories. And there are a lot of opportunities to do that, and you should have a closer look. And sometimes the story is quite convoluted, as in this, that it's actually going via the sulfur and via thiobacillus and oxidizing the sulfur, and therefore increasing the solubility of the phosphate rock that was applied together with TSB. Then, of course, the balanced composition according to plant requirements is an important factor. We already talked about that if we don't apply, or if we don't have an adequate availability of all the nutrients that we need for the specific crop, we are probably always constrained by that nutrient that is as a minimum factor. We have several different aspects here of interactions of different nutrients, and one we have to maybe try to conceptually separate those two issues. One is interactions of nutrients in the soil, where one nutrient affects the availability of another nutrient. But then we have also the interactions of nutrients in the plant. And those two sometimes go together or not, but in any case, you should think always where you would expect your interactions, whether in soil or in the plant. And possible interactions are through competition, that one nutrient competes with another nutrient for exchange sites, or for transport, pH effects, that the pH is changed by one nutrient and that affects the availability of another nutrient. Oxidation reduction phenomena, that we induce oxidation or reduction by the application of one fertilizer nutrients, and that can affect other nutrients. Precipitation, of course, I mean that's something we've been talking about all the time, that we might maybe apply lime and that will decrease possibly if we over apply lime, which you probably rarely do, but it's a possibility that you apply so much lime that you precipitate your phosphate. And then of course effects on biological processes, which are very important, that we might influence our nitrification by application of one or the other nutrients. So that is pretty important. Here are some examples how interaction of different nutrients in soil might work. For instance, more potassium decreases ammonium fixation. Why is that? How does that work? Why would these, especially those two, nitrogen, potassium? We've been talking. Joseph.
I think because potassium takes the place in the aluminum crystals and replaces the ammonium. So much of potassium is trapped within ammonium, so ammonium becomes more available.
Yeah. So it seems that ammonium and potassium are from their size and their charge, they're both monovalent, and they have hydrated, they have the same size. It seems that they're competing for the same adsorption sites, and you mentioned that, for instance, one site that they especially compete for is this specific site where the ammonium and the potassium really fit nicely in this octaeder tetraeder space in interlayers, for instance, of clay minerals, secondary clay minerals. Yeah, so that's very important, that you actually might improve ammonium availability or nitrogen availability by applying potassium. Application of phosphate might increase the molybdenum availability, for instance, and a lot of that you see there are some probably in there. So a lot of those effects are not very straightforward and actually hard to test. We're getting a little bit better through modern advances in spectroscopy, but it's very hard to address those questions just with a wet chemical method. Probably there's a competition happening between phosphate and molybdenum ions for the same exchange sites. So you see here these all of these examples also here. The next one, application of ammonium, increasing the iron and manganese availability, probably due to pH decrease during oxidation. Application of gypsum increases the zinc availability because the zinc sulfate is formed. In what form would be the zinc otherwise? What are other? Where would it be? Why is it more available as zinc sulfate? Where else could it be? The zinc. take an educated guess. Just have a guess. Krista, what do you think? In some minerals or adsorbed? What at what pH does micronutrients? At what pH are they better available? Higher pH, they're lower availability. So lower pH, they are high availability. Macronutrients and calcium, magnesium, potassium are exactly opposite to micronutrients, to most micronutrients. So micronutrients are usually well available at low pH, and macronutrients, calcium, magnesium, potassium, are well available at high pH. So at higher pH, we probably have more adsorption, maybe even precipitation of zinc to zinc carbonates. And if the sulfur is capturing that zinc and zinc sulfate is formed, then we probably increase our overall zinc availability. There are some others. For instance, the application of chloride can decrease the nitrification, and that, of course, can lead to lower leaching losses. That's a possibility because we know that nitrate is very mobile in soil, so we have a very rapid leaching of nitrates. If we can decrease nitrification, that might decrease also leaching losses and lead to a higher nitrate availability and nitrogen availability. So there are a multitude of different ways how that can happen. Here, for instance, the example for the chloride applications, and that is very often achieved through potassium applications, as you might guess, because we have talked about it. Potassium is mostly applied as potassium chloride, and the potassium chloride is actually half potassium, but on the other half is chloride. And that can lead, as you can see here, with higher potassium applications that would be equivalent to chloride, the foliar manganese contents increased dramatically. And that led, in this example for bush beans, to a dramatic decrease, more than halved the yields of bush beans. So you might have thought you would increase your yields by being smart and applying potassium chloride because you have maybe identified a potassium deficiency. But what you actually did, you halved your yields. And unless you really know that potassium chloride doesn't only contain potassium but also chloride, and what the chloride can do to manganese, which then decreases your yields, you are probably trying to apply more potassium, or you think that nitrogen is limiting or something else. So you need, it requires a multi-step thinking. You need to realize that with applying one nutrient, you might co-apply something else, which might have an effect on another nutrient, which might then be toxic to the plant or beneficial. It can go either way. So it really requires an intricate understanding of what these fertilizers are all about, how they interact, how nutrients interact in the soil with each other. So that is really very important. So it's just a placeholder. It's not a specific example that you need to learn by heart or know about this specific mechanisms. I forget this stuff all the time. But you at least need to know that something like that can happen, these multi-step processes. So you really need to think about all the possibilities that how nutrient deficiencies or toxicities can happen. And very often that applies thinking out that the box and not just in cause and effect for one nutrient. Thank you very much. That is for